I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but this very room was the set of a movie about 7 years ago. You're sitting on set right now, and I've got a picture to prove it. Some of you don't look like you trust me. So this is it's a small, more of a local or regional film, independent film that was shot. And I received a phone call just shortly after I became pastor here. And they said, can we use your auditorium to film a scene of a movie? I said, well, of course you can. But what I didn't anticipate, and again, this is some of you can't see the picture really great, but there's some people with lighting and things like that are off in the left corner of that screen. And what I didn't expect was what would result afterwards. And that was that they cast a gentleman to be the pastor in that movie. And you can go to the next slide. His name is Alex Boyer. As you can tell, there's an incredible resemblance between myself and him. And he had, in his younger years, he was part of a British pop band that toured with Simon and Garfunkel and MC Hammer and several well-known figures in the 90s. And then a little bit later on, he had just come off of America's Got Talent before he was cast for this part in the movie. And so when people came to church here for the next few months, they had high expectations. They wanted to meet this pastor that they had seen in the movie. But there was only one problem. The person they'd seen in the movie was an actor and wasn't actually the pastor. So it was kind of a letdown when they came and found me. But I was a pastor, so that was helpful in some regards. And that's kind of what we run into in today's conversation with Jesus and some of the religious leaders. And there's a phrase that Jesus has used over and over again, and that's, it's woe to you, which comes across a little weird in English, but it really means I'm grieved for you. Scribes and Pharisees, which were two different categories of religious leaders in Jerusalem in Jesus' day. And he calls them hypocrites, which, again, in our culture has a little bit of an edge on it, but it really means actors, people who are playing a part, playing a role that they're really, not. And so he's telling these religious leaders, I'm grieved for you because you're playing a part, you're actors. Just like this gentleman, he did a great job. He looked the part of the pastor, but he wasn't actually a pastor. And so the religious leaders, they look the part, but they don't have the heart to back it up. And that's what we look at today in these passages. We've been moving through some conversations. This is just a couple of days before Jesus' betrayal, arrest, crucifixion, and later on resurrection from the grave. And so he's in these final moments having these really important conversations with his students who've been following him, and also with some of the religious leaders who have been leading Israel in a totally different direction than where God's heart is at. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Jesus is pointing out inconsistencies in these religious leaders. First, it was the ways that they acted. They put a lot of heavy demands on the people, but they didn't want to follow through. They could just disregard those same demands they were putting on the people. And Jesus says that's not right. They were seeking attention and putting themselves first. Jesus calls them out for that. They were misrepresenting God's kingdom by making it seem next to impossible to get into. And they were making people miserable in the process because they expected this, hyper dedication or perfection. And then last week we talked about how Jesus goes, he moves from the way they're acting to the way they're thinking, their logic, and they're looking for loopholes to get out of promises that they make to God and people. And they're focused on tithing or giving a tenth of their spices, but they're missing out on the reason why people give in the first place, and that's to actually promote justice and love people. Totally missing out on the reason for it. And they think that somebody's outer appearance is what makes them really, really appealing. And maybe in some cases that's the case, but maybe we've met beautiful or handsome people in our lives who the way they act, the way they treat people is anything but that. So Jesus is pointing out those inconsistencies. And now he moves from the actions and the thinking into their heart and their character and their very nature as people. That's what we get to see this morning. And maybe as we look into this, we see a little reflection of ourselves. Maybe it's that we are a contrast, and that's a good thing. Or maybe there are some areas of our nature and our character that still need to be smoothed out a little bit and refined a little bit, and there's some challenging things that we have today to learn as well. And so this is, if you've been with us the past probably a couple of months now, this is anything but a lecture. I'm going to pose some questions to you guys as well. And I want to get your feedback in real time because we can learn best, I think, when we're learning from each other as a group and we're having this discussion, not just you sitting back and listening to one person talk about their perspectives or their opinions. So we want to get your input. If you have some things to say, we'd love to hear what you have to share in a few moments as well. One of the things about their nature is they're kind of defiant. They're kind of rebellious in a sense. And Jesus is going to use a comparison. He's going to compare these people to tombs that look really beautiful on the outside, but inside maybe aren't. And here's what he says. This is verse 27 and 28 in Matthew chapter 23, which is where we're camped out this morning. He says, speaking to these religious leaders, you're like whitewashed tombs, painted tombs. They look beautiful on the outside, but inside they're full of bones of dead people and every kind of impurity. They look like they're blooming. That's what the word beautiful that Jesus chooses is. It literally means blooming, blossoming, like the flowers in spring. I mean, these look like just beautiful monuments. But inside, if you go inside, things are different. And to bring us into the Jewish way of thinking about death and tombs and things of that nature, to the religious leaders of Jesus' day, there was actually nothing that you could imagine that was more unclean than a corpse, than a dead body. They had some documents that were just written maybe a century or two later after this point that described different grades of uncleanness as the Jewish rabbis would discuss in Jesus' day. And they called a body, a corpse, the father of all uncleannesses. Like you couldn't come up with anything more ritually unclean than a dead body. And if you touched one, then it made you in a category called the father of uncleanness. And once you had touched it, you had to wait 7 days. You had to go through a very specific purification process that the Jewish Old Testament law laid out for you. And if you touched anything or anybody in that time period, you were contagious, and you would make them unclean as well. If you went into any kind of enclosed room, like a tomb that had a dead body inside of it, it made that person impure for the next 7 days or until they went through this elaborate process as well. And so, in other words, contacting or entering a chamber, a tomb with human remains, it contaminated someone. It made you contagious, and that's the way that they viewed that. And so Jesus is saying, beautiful on the outside, contaminating on the inside. That's kind of what you all have become. He says in the same way in verse 28, on the outside, you seem righteous to people. And the word he uses, it's another pictorial word. It's not seem, and literally it's the word shine. Like you gleam, you shine. When people look at you, they think, wow, that right there, that's a good person. So I want to open this question up to you guys for some thought and feedback. What kinds of things do people do to shine? I mean, to sparkle, to look really religious, really spiritual, really put together on the outside, like they have a great relationship with God, with other people, to give off that good moral impression. What do people do today? Okay, brag about themselves. Yeah. Did you see what I did? Did you see how I handled that situation? Look at me shine, right? What are some other things people do to draw attention? What? Their apparel, okay? We can use clothing to look good. I mean, I have to admit, if you look at the way that I dress and the way that the pastor or the guy that played the part of the pastor in the movie dressed, I mean, he's got me beat 10 times over. So sometimes we dress certain ways maybe to show how shining we are, how committed, how religious we are. Yes?
Give a lot of money and tell everybody about it.
Oh yeah, give a lot of money, right? Yeah. Did you see what I put in the collection? Yeah. Did you know about that? Yeah. And not just do it, draw attention to it, right? Drop that coin down from a couple feet or tell people afterwards. I was doing my taxes, and I got my giving statement back from my church, and let's just say that, there were a lot of deductions this year. So, yes?
You brag about the things they do.
Sure.
They want to do.
Yeah, brag about the things they do or want to do, and I would say maybe in the category of serving people, because, there's maybe a good motive for serving people, but maybe we do it just so we look good. Yeah, those are some great thoughts. And I think the people that Jesus was speaking to at this point in time, maybe they did the same things. And then there's another question, and that is, are those things really bad? Now, giving wouldn't be inherently bad. Dressing nice wouldn't be inherently bad. Dressing more casually wouldn't be inherently bad. Serving people, those are good things, right? But it comes down, I think, partly to motive. What's motivating us? Is it attention? Or is it the opposite end of the spectrum, which is fear? If I don't do this, what are people going to think about me in a negative sense? We fear people, or maybe even God. We've gotten this impression over the years that, if I don't do enough stuff to please God, like, he won't accept me, and maybe that'll carry on over to my relationship with him after this life is over, and so I just don't know. I'm afraid of him, so I'm going to try to do what I can to please him or appease him or however. And then the other side of it is, what those things are communicating to people. Is it something that's false? Like, for example, if I believe that dressing really, really nice makes me a more spiritual person, when I measure that with what Jesus is teaching, do I ever find something like that come out of Jesus' mouth? Probably not. And so am I giving a false impression, or even something like giving. The Bible talks about giving, but the fact that I tithe a certain percentage of money every week, that's nothing, at least in the New Testament church, that's prescribed. It's more the heart behind it and the action and the intention. And so if I'm trying to represent that in order to be a good person or in order to please God, you have to give X percentage of your income in, 2023, I might be representing some things in kind of a false way. There's some stuff to think about. And again, maybe we try to shine outwardly in ways that are falsely motivated or just in ways that are kind of misleading to people. That's something that we have to wrestle with as well. Jesus says inside, you look great on the outside, but inside you're full of, and uses that word hypocrisy or acting again. And he also adds another word, and that's lawlessness. Lawlessness, it ties back into the word for law in the Old Testament of the Bible, which is Torah. And the word that we translate law in a lot of our English translations, it means instruction, so God's instructions. They're kind of anti-instructions. Some of you might be anti-instructions. There's a couple categories of people normally. Let's say you buy a product or maybe it's something for one of your kids or family member or friend, and it's one of those items for a Christmas gift, but you kind of got to put it together ahead of time, and you're pulling it out, and some of you love to follow instruction manuals. I mean, a 30-page manual is like a beautiful thing, step by step. You're OCD, and you follow the process. How many of you are that person? I got a couple. And then there's the opposite end of the spectrum. Instructions. I don't need instructions. I don't do this. How many of you are that? Hey, honest people. All right. And when you do that, normally, sometimes things come together really well. But I remember putting together a couple of kids' tricycle big wheel things and having a few spare parts afterwards and going, man, I hope that works out. Just see a kid, chugging down the sidewalk at 15, 20 miles an hour, and all of a sudden a wheel shoots off here and a handlebar comes off there, and, that's where that extra bolt went. Oh, okay. Things don't always work out so well when we do things our way and when we ignore instructions. And that's what's happening with these religious leaders, only it's God's instruction, and they're just tossing it aside. They look like they're shining and they're blossoming, but they're ignoring God's instructions. And instead, they're just choosing whatever looks good or seems good, or looks delightful, or looks desirable, or seems wise to them. And maybe sometimes they're getting it right, and maybe a lot of times they're getting it wrong. And that's the theme. The same thing goes back to the first few chapters of the Bible when these characters named Adam or the human and Eve, they're at this tree, they're trying to decide, am I going to take this, I think symbolically, take the right to decide what's good and evil, good and bad into my own hands? Or am I going to, wait for God to show that to me? And it just looks too good in the moment, and they decide, we've got this. And then there's another figure that comes in, the snake, the serpent, and we'll talk about him in a moment today in this passage as well, because Jesus brings it up, I think, or at least alludes to it. But they're having this conversation, and they're convinced, I bet I could figure out this manual a little better than God. Maybe there's some things he's keeping back, I bet we could figure out what's wise, and this looks good, and it looks delightful, so let's go for it. And people, we've been wrestling with the same thing ever since, and we deal with it. All of us struggle with that, are we going to listen to what God says about what's good and bad for us and for people in general, or are we going to just try to figure that out for ourselves and do what's wise? Sometimes we go our own way, and it seems like it's working out okay, and other times, we could have used God's instruction in it. But that's really the heart of these religious leaders. They don't really care about God's instructions. They want to choose whatever is best to them. But their choices aren't bringing them closer to God because Jesus is right there and they're in conflict with him. And they're not bringing them closer to other people, too. They're actually kind of isolating them into their own little clique where all the religious leaders, they're in their category and everybody else is left outside of that. They were playing that Garden of Eden scene from the first place. They're actually defiant in their heart and in their nature. And not only that, they're kind of deceptive as well, because they're doing some other things, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, that appear to be one way, but it's not really consistent with the way that they're operating as people. In Japan, it's a very different culture from here, but citizens of Japan, for the most part, they love to celebrate Christmas. At Christmas time in Japan, people exchange gifts, and Christmas parties are held across Japan. And they have a special Japanese Christmas cake. It's a white sponge cake covered with cream and strawberries that they make every year around the Christmas season. If you go into big cities in Japan, there's Christmas lights absolutely everywhere. There's inflatable Santas, and there's Christmas trees in people's homes and in public. Couples spend time together, and they give gifts on Christmas Eve. And families make reservations for months in advance at all the KFC restaurants throughout Japan, because there was some marketing campaign in the 1970s that connected Christmas celebration with KFC fried chicken. And so you can't get a reservation at KFC anywhere in Japan at Christmas time. It's part of their Christmas traditions. But the irony is that 1.5% of the Japanese population actually would say that they're Christian. And so they're celebrating all these things that at the roots of it are connected to Jesus, but they don't have, an understanding of that in their hearts. They don't actually follow Jesus. And so seeing their celebration doesn't really give an accurate representation of what's in their hearts, what they believe, what they feel, what they believe to be true. And the same thing is indicative of these religious leaders in Jesus' day, because they're really good at celebrations and honoring certain things, customs, and traditions, which we'll read about in a second, but their hearts aren't really in those things at all. In verse 29, Jesus uses that phrase again, woe to you, or I'm grieved for you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, actors. And then he says, you build the tombs of the prophets. That's kind of weird, because a lot of these prophets in the Old Testament, they died 400 or 500 years before these religious leaders. And so I thought that's kind of odd that Jesus would say something like that. Like, what's he talking about? So I did a little digging, and I can't tell you absolutely for certain, but I found some cool stuff, and so I want to throw it your way. So there is actually a place, it's just to the east of Jerusalem, it's on the Mount of Olives. It's called the tomb or the cave of the prophets, and this is what it looks like on the outside. So somebody did a lot of work to make this thing. In fact, let's look at a couple more pictures. The next one, this is the layout inside of it. There's actually 38 places cut out inside of this for tombs for different people. And ironically, archaeology dates this to the 1st century, so to the time of Jesus, when this huge complex was being built in the rock just across from Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. And you can go to the next picture as well. This is a couple of pictures of the entrance, just to give you kind of a scope of the size of it. You can hit the last picture as well. These are some of the individual places inside. Probably the smaller things, they had ossuaries or bone boxes that they would place human remains into boxes, stone boxes, and place them on the shelves. And then maybe other places were more like tombs where they would put bodies to rest for a while. And so this was actually built, we don't know for certain, but according to Jewish tradition that was passed along and recorded years and years later, supposedly this was made to honor the prophets, the last 3 prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last prophets to write, the last prophets to live in the Old Testament. And so these religious leaders were involved in this project, and very possibly that's what Jesus is referencing. When he says, you build the tomb of the prophets, he's just thinking about that complex right across from them on the Mount of Olives. Like, you guys are pushing this construction project in honor of these prophets. So they're constructing it. Maybe it's in honor of them, or maybe they're actually reburying the bones of these prophets in that complex. We don't know for certain. But they're following these different burial customs. I think that's interesting. We'll look at another one in a moment. But they're trying to honor these people. And I want to ask you at this point, too, are there any things that your family, that your ancestors maybe, or a couple generations of your family, are there any things that your family does to honor family members, loved ones who have passed on from this life? Any kinds of traditions, any kinds of maybe ceremonial things that your family goes through, any kinds of practices that you all have to honor people in your family? What do you do when a loved one passes on?
We look at their pictures and talk about them.
Look at their pictures and talk about them? Yeah. That was a special thing. My grandfather passed away several years ago, and I remember sitting around the house at my aunt and uncle's home just passing around scrapbooks, because that was in the era of scrapbooks. Now it's all, Facebook and online, and pictures are passed around that way. But we had, from the time my grandfather was in his 20s, like pictures of him in a uniform when he was in World War II, all the way up to like in his early 90s when he passed away. And so, yeah, those are special times. Yes? You have an yeah, an American flag in a box with the name of the time of the birth and the death. Yeah, especially for people who've served in the military, that's a way that we have, a lot of people have in our country of honoring people. Yes?
I believe people used to visit grave sites when they were local,
Okay.
as they were. In today's world, many grave sites are never visited because people are in other states, other places, and the grave sites are left alone.
That's a great point, yeah. When communities were more localized, it was very common to visit grave sites, and maybe you live close to where one of your loved ones is buried as well. Maybe you do that, but in our global society today, oftentimes that's more difficult, yeah. Maybe one more thing that somebody has. Anything else that you have to share? Customs that you all have, yes?
What I felt most people do, and I feel I did it as well, is that people want to remember the person and their life, but a lot of times people only know them as a senior as we do.
Sure, they want to remember.
It's good to have a member of the family or someone who knew them well tell of their life before, so they knew them as a child.
Yeah, that's a good comment.
What they did, so they know that was a real human being with a heart
Yeah.
that loved them.
That was a good point as well. She said, oftentimes we only know someone maybe later on in their lives. So having people tell stories about what their life was like, maybe when they're in their younger years or things like that, that's another way of remembering. And I want to kind of camp out on the word remembering, because I think that's another thing that we'll see in Jesus' next statement that was huge in the Jewish culture as well. So he said he was talking about building the tombs of the prophets and trying to honor these religious people. And then the next thing he says, you also decorate the graves of the righteous. And there's a couple of nuances that these words would have when they were written in the Greek language, the first century, that we don't necessarily see come out in our English translations as well. Decorate just has this idea of, preparing and putting in order. And so maybe, you're decorating literally something or just preparing things, getting it ready. But the word grave that's used is actually the word for remembrance or remembrances. And in the Jewish culture, they tied in gravestones with a way of remembering people. I was curious. I didn't actually know this until this past week, but the tradition of putting gravestones on graves actually started with the Hebrew culture. In fact, if you go way back to Genesis chapter 35, when Jacob's wife Rachel dies, he puts up this memorial, this pillar of stone at her grave. And from that point on, in Jewish culture, gravestones became a thing to mark graves for different reasons. Part of it was that they wanted a way of remembering someone, of looking back years and years or even centuries later and having a point of remembrance, which I would say is consistent with the way that our culture uses gravestones or headstones today as well. You can have this more permanent thing that will last for a period of time, and that'll be a point of remembrance of that person. You can have a place to go back to and something to rekindle the memory of that person. It also is used in a more practical sense because priests in Israel could not come within so many feet of a dead body. And so they would see that marker, and if they were a practicing member of the priesthood in Old Testament or early New Testament Israel, they would stay a certain distance away from that gravesite so that they didn't become ritually impure. So there's a couple of purposes behind it. But they basically carved gravestones to remember people. And it says righteous people. So people who love God and people who love people really, really well. And that's a good thing, right? To remember these people. And so what you get from the outer appearance from these people, what it seems like is that they want to honor their prophets, the people that God really used throughout their nation's history to speak his words to them. They want to honor them. And the people in their communities who were loving people, who love God and love people well, they want to remember them, which is great. The only thing is, that's not really the way that they are inside their hearts. And Jesus points out that. Because they claim to be more righteous. In verse 30, it says, Jesus says to them, you say If we lived in the days of our ancestors, we wouldn't have taken part with them in the shedding of the prophet's blood. So you realize that their story has a little bit of a darker past. Generations previously in their family, and the Bible doesn't record this, but some other Jewish text does, they were, according to Jewish history, their ancestors were responsible for killing some of the prophets. Ironically, even Zechariah, who was one of the 3 people that they were building that massive tomb complex in honor of right across the valley on the Mount of Olives. And so one of the very people they were saying they honored, some of their relatives were responsible for killing. And they would say, there's no way we would have done something like that. We're beyond that. We're more righteous than they are. And it'd be fine if they were, if they'd moved past that. But what are they contemplating at this very moment in time? Killing Jesus, right? We would never have done that, what our ancestors did. But in 2 more days from now, we'll do that very thing. In fact, to the Son of God on earth, we'll repeat the sins of our fathers. So what you get is very deceptive. On the one hand, we're all about honoring people who love people and God and people who represent God well, but at the same time, we're really not, because we can't wait to kill Jesus. How ironic. Why are they this way? And we're going to close with kind of like the root of this issue in their hearts. And I think this may be the root of what we deal with in our hearts as well, kind of the battle and the conflict that we face at different points in time. And Jesus says, since you talked about your ancestors, let's talk about your ancestors. Because your descent, the type of people and the type of maybe attitudes and approach that you come from as humans, but also as people who are kind of driven by the way that you want to live life and ignoring God's instructions, those things have a lot to do with why you are the way you are in your heart. He says in verse 31, so you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. By saying we would have never done what our ancestors did, you're saying those were our ancestors. The people in our family, they did that. And Jesus says, fill up then the measure of your ancestors' sins, which is pretty blatant, right? He knows what's happening in their minds. He knows what they are considering. But he's saying, you know what? You are definitely sons of the families who killed these earlier prophets. We might use a phrase in our culture, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You're a lot like your family members who came before you. And sometimes we have to be careful about that as well. And this is more of a vulnerable question, so it may not even be something that you're comfortable with answering, but if you are, I think it's helpful for us to get insights and perspective in each other and to know each other well. But different families, like you have different things that characterize generations of your family. Sometimes it's a trait. Sometimes it's this thread of a career choice that like different generations of your family tend to make. Sometimes it's a struggle, or it's a behavior, or it's an addiction, or it's a pattern, good pattern or negative pattern. But do any of you have generations of your family that have either struggled with or maybe been defined by, in a good sense, a specific trait or a specific kind of vein that you can trace through that? Do any of you have like patterns that flow through generations of your family?
A lot of us work in the education system.
Okay. A lot of you work in the education system, education field. That's something that you can see where maybe parents or grandparents, they've all been involved in education. Sure. And not all of your families have those kinds of patterns. So just want to see if you guys have anything that you notice.
Have a lot of nurses and paramedics.
Okay, a lot of medical people in your family for generations. Yeah.
Military.
A lot of military in your family. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Anything else you want to share? I realize that's a personal one too, and so maybe the point is just to bring some things up, in your mind and cause you to just not necessarily sometimes that can be a painful thing, but just to be aware of what's happening. And I think to some degree, maybe the religious leaders had lost sight of some of these trends in their own family. And if you're not aware of something, maybe it's hard to address it, or it's easy for something to sneak up on you in your life as well. And maybe that's part of the reason why. But they had these generational patterns or cycles that were flowing into them as well. As we're going to get to in a moment, though, there's hope, even when that's the case. And Jesus is going to pull that out as well. But before he does, he says something next, and this is not flattering. He says, snakes, brood of vipers. That is not good imagery. when you think about the Bible and you hear certain words, there's certain words and themes that come up over and over again. Where do you hear about snakes in the Bible? Where? Adam and Eve, okay. There's a snake that appears, chapter 3. Anywhere else that you remember hearing about snakes? Huh? Moses, I heard Moses, he has a snake, a rod that turns into a snake. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Is there a staff that they have a snake on?
Sure. Yeah, there's an instance where Israel is complaining out in the desert when they're wandering and they get bit by poisonous snakes, and God tells Moses to put a bronze snake up on a pole and hold it up so people will be healed. So what's interesting is a lot of these snakes, they don't have good associations. It's associated with like judgment situations like God versus Egypt, or people in rebellion and snakes in the desert causing death and solutions God needs to pose to that, or this really deceptive, sly, shrewd snake coming up and telling Adam and Eve they didn't need God's way of living life. They probably could come up with a better way on their own. And so these are the images. And so we should associate these people with that type of an imagery. So they're operating a lot like that snake in the garden. What did the snake in the garden do? How did he approach situations? What kind of things did he say? You said slither, okay. Kind of a pictorial word. Yeah, you need to question God. Yeah. What? He deceived, sure. Yeah. Did God really tell you you would die if you ate from this tree? God must not love you. You know, you could become like God if you eat this fruit. You know, it's beautiful and it's good to eat. You're missing out. And he says all these things to very, very, in a sneaky way, right, to oppose God and what he's doing. And he still does it, yeah. And so that's kind of the way that these people operate. Ironically, the religious leaders are operating in the same way with people. And he calls them brood of vipers. You're just the offspring of the snake. And if you see God's conversation in Genesis 3 with the snake after Adam and Eve have been deceived, he tells them that there's going to be some conflict between this woman's seed or descendant eventually and the snake's seed or descendants eventually. And so maybe what we're seeing play out with Jesus and these religious leaders is some of what that was predicting. This conflict between those two groups or two people that have polar opposite ways of dealing with things and navigating life. And so they are the seed of the snake. That's who they really are. That's their descent. Their ancestor, I mean, they have some human ancestors, and they're not great examples either. But their true ancestor is this snake, because they're acting like his kids. And then Jesus says something that sounds kind of like flagrant in English. He says, how can you escape being condemned to hell? And I think this can come across a little bit like, one, it comes across as like, wow, that was direct, that was bold. But I want us to kind of process something here. When you hear the word hell, what is the first thing you think of? Fire. What else? Darkness. Satan. When you think of Satan, what do you think of? Evil? Any of you see like somebody with a pitchfork and like a couple horns and pointy tail, maybe? What else do you think of when you hear the word hell, what comes to mind? Punishment. Misery. What? Separation. Yeah. These are things that come to mind. And when Jesus is speaking with these people, I think one of the things we have to be careful with when we read our Bibles, because we have a cultural idea of what hell is, from things we've heard, from Halloween, from churches we've gone to, all those things like import all the definitions of what hell is and what hell looks like. And so we have to be really careful, instead of importing everything we think of, to just go, I think, with where the conversation is leading, what Jesus is saying in each situation. And maybe you can go to other conversations Jesus is having and you can fill in some more pieces of the puzzle, but here's what Jesus is saying directly to them. And maybe it doesn't fill in all those gaps that we fill in when we use a word like hell in the English translation. What Jesus is actually saying here he's not saying, like, if you translate those Greek words that are in the New Testament directly, he's not saying, how can you escape being condemned to hell? He's saying, how might you escape the sentence that's about to come upon you of being sentenced to the valley of mourning? So valley of mourning is translated as hell, but that's what he's saying. He's using a place called the Valley of Mourning outside of Jerusalem. And he's saying, what could you do to escape the sentence that you're going to face someday? And maybe he's talking about an eternal sentence, but he doesn't elaborate here. But whatever that sentence is, it's going to lead these religious leaders to a place of regret and a place of mourning. So maybe that is eternal condemnation and separation. Or maybe it's not. But whatever it is, it's a place that involves grief and mourning. The way that they are headed and the way their heart is headed is going to result in them grieving and them mourning that they didn't make a change at some point in time. And maybe that's an eternal grief and eternal mourning, but Jesus doesn't fill in the gaps here. But it's going to lead to that. But he says, how could you get out of that? How might you be able to escape this situation that you found yourselves in? Situation where you look like the snake, and where you look like your ancestors who had these generational cycles of negative patterns of behavior. How do you think you could get out of that? Is there a way out? He's actually given them another chance to escape where they're headed and escape the misery that they're headed toward and the mourning that they're headed toward if they continue down this path in life. He says there's a way out. And then in verse 34, he says, this is why I'm sending you prophets and sages or wise people and scribes. This is why I'm doing this. And he doesn't say, this is why I did this in the past. He says, this is why I'm doing this right now. What types of people might God be sending to these scribes and these Pharisees and religious leaders right at that moment to tell them a better way than the way they're going? Perhaps Jesus himself. Perhaps Jesus' group of followers. Perhaps some of the early church that's going to come to believe in Jesus over the next 3 or 4 years. Perhaps those are the very people that God is putting in their lives to give them another chance to see a better way. And maybe some of them will. And some of them will, instead of heading toward a destination of mourning, they'll have a life that's abundant and experience joy and celebration and hope and eternity with God in his presence. Maybe there's a different way and a way to redirect those paths because God's sending another wave of people to represent himself. And they're coming right before those religious leaders. But Jesus knows what's going to happen. And he says, some of those people, the people that I'm sending to give you another chance, you're going to kill them, and you're going to crucify them. I think he's talking about himself. And some of them, you're going to whip in your synagogues. I think he's talking about his 12, because 11 of them, the ones that didn't betray Jesus, maybe a year later, they find themselves being flogged by these religious leaders for speaking in the name of Jesus. And he says, some of them you're going to chase from town to town. Maybe he's talking about the early church getting driven out of Jerusalem, or the Apostle Paul going after churches in Damascus before he came to know Jesus. And so it's interesting how these things begin to fulfill themselves. But Jesus' point, he says, I know you're just going to choose to repeat the sins of your ancestors, but you don't have to. In fact, you've got an opportunity right now to make a change, to have a different heart. And I think that's encouraging to us because even if we see ourselves trapped in certain patterns of behavior or certain heart conditions, certain viewpoints toward people, there's an opportunity to make a change of direction, even right now, toward a way of hope and away from a way of mourning and misery. And that's important, I think, for us to recognize as well. We're not doomed to repeat these negative tendencies of our ancestors. We're not defined by that, even though it might be the easiest route for us to go. I want to close with just 2 questions, and you can take these with you to kind of ponder. First question, this goes back to what we talked about earlier. What image am I trying to portray? Because they're all about images, the religious leaders are. How can we look good on the outside? How can we shine bright? How can we paint those tombs to make those graves look beautiful? How can we honor our ancestors and celebrate the lives of these righteous people so others will know how great we are? What type of image am I trying to portray? And does it actually complement the person I am in my heart? Or does it contradict the person I am in my heart? And if it contradicts, what am I going to do about that? Or what do I need to do about that? Secondly, is it possible to break negative generational patterns? I'd say Jesus seems to think so, but then there's a bigger question of how. And that's a thing we can't answer in a couple minutes here. There's a lot of deeper, I think, research and conversations and digging in scripture and looking at this passage and a lot of other similar ones in the Bible. That's a deep question to have conversations over. But I think it's an important one because Jesus seems to think there's hope to make change.